Hey guys, we're here to talk about financial crisis in the 1830s versus 1930s. President during the 1830s was Martin Van Buren, and during the 1930s was President Franklin D. Roosevelt. In the bottom right corner here, we have a little episode from Seinfeld with the Van Buren boys, if you've ever seen that before. First thing we're going to talk about, though, is the Panic of 1837. To start talking about the Panic of 1837, we first want to talk about what defines a financial crisis. And that's basically a disturbance to the financial market. Whereas markets are dependent on money, so are families. And when families try and go to the bank to get their money, and the bank has already loaned out their money to other people so that they can't give the families the money they want, the bank loses its business and eventually goes under and has to close. This process is basically what starts the
Panic of 1837 can be broken down to about 5 causes. The first being overspeculation, in which people were buying land with money that they didn't have, and companies were selling them land that they didn't have. And banks were loaning out too much money that they didn't have. And the people that they were loaning money to couldn't pay them back as well. And the next cause is that the federal government was insisting that people make purchases with coinage rather than cash. So the value of money was deflating very, very fast. And then, due to the high demand for land, the value of the land was inflated highly. And the last main reason was that the Bank of England pulled out their reserves in America, so banks lost a lot of support and money through that. Ain't nobody got time for losing money.
Ain't nobody got time for that. Ain't nobody got time for that. Ain't nobody got
1837 had many effects on the economy. The first being that the loans that people had taken out of the bank had dried up and left the banks with nothing. And then second, the people that had moved west lost the land that they had bought because the banks were taking it back because the loans had dried up. And the paper money had become worthless, so people couldn't buy anything with an American dollar. And foreign countries wouldn't even accept the American dollar. And the unemployment number rose to around 10%, so very high unemployment for this time. And starvation on the streets, as well as the number of homeless people, increased. With an increase in poverty, there is an increase in crime, so you better
Talking about the Great Depression, which is another financial crisis that took place during the 1930s. So what was going on during this time is the United States had just pulled out, or just won World War I, and people were on a spending high. And you can see on this chart right here, during about 1920-ish, people started spending a lot of money, and they actually started buying on margin, which means that you put a little down payment down at the beginning, and then you pay the rest back later. Of course, later on, when the stock market crashed and a lot of people lost their money, people that bought on margin, the companies didn't get their full money back, so they went down as well. Also during this time, President Woodrow Wilson signed in the 18th Amendment, which is an alcohol ban, and that caused a lot of crime rates to go up. Illegal alcohol was passed around, and mob leaders like Al Capone rose to power.
Causes the Great Depression can be summed up in, first of all, the stock market crashed in 1929, which was in $40 billion was lost, and this affected all stockbrokers. Next we have is banks. In reference to 1837, people began to become more fearful of losing their money. So fearful of this, people went to the banks and took their money out, but uninsured banks couldn't give their money back. So over 9,000 banks in 1930s collapsed. Another cause is the drought, known as the Dust Bowl, which was when conditions became so bad that farmers had to produce less crops, so prices had to rise and people couldn't afford crops anymore, so farms began to fall. So now we overhear the products like the Model T. Since the economy began to fall, people had to focus more on their families than pleasures, so people couldn't afford to buy like the Model T, so certain industries began to fall. Now we're going to examine how all these causes led to a jobless society. The Depression started over here with industries. Because people were losing so much money, people couldn't afford to buy products from said industries. And because of this, industries began to fall, and people at these industries began to lose their jobs. And because of this, a rise in unemployment began to rise. So because unemployment began to rise, men began to lose their jobs, And when men lost their jobs, they couldn't afford to feed their families, so men began to leave their families and left women to feed their children. And at the time, the women's rights were when women couldn't get jobs and couldn't afford to keep their families. And because people didn't have money, people began to sell their own possessions, like the Model T for instance, where they sold their own parts from the car to get money to survive.
Anything that helped the United States rise out of the Great Depression was the entry into World War II. Things like war bonds helped the economy, and by people promoting the war effort by putting forward a little bit of money at a time. Another factor that played a big role was women, because women before were never allowed to work, and now that they're in factories, and like this bottom right picture here, they're producing a lot of tanks and equipment that are sent off to the war in Europe. And because of this, industry picks up a lot, and you can tell from this graph right here, right around about 1940-ish, 1939, industry picks up a lot, and the rate of profit picks up a lot because of the U.S. involvement in World War II. There's a lot more industry, and people were producing a lot of equipment for the war. And then once the war actually ended, the economy prospered even more because of the baby boom and other factors. The similarities and the differences between the causes and effects of both the financial crises of the 1830s and 1930s. So first off, with the 1830s, a lot of the idea of manifest destiny played a huge role in overspeculation and people moving west. And of course, overspeculation hurt the economy by selling more land than was actually there. And then for the 1930s, you have the stock market crash of 1929 that played the major role in the economic downfall. And of course, both financial crises were dependent on banks loaning out too much money. And then people went to go get their money and their money wasn't there, and so banks had to close. So this happened for both the 1830s and 1930s. So now differences between the way they were recovered was that 1830s, the Panic of 1837 was recovered by the Tariff of 1842, which slowly brought back in money for the economy by taxing foreign imports. And then the 1930s and the Great Depression was mainly recovered through Roosevelt's New Deal, which had reconstruction plans for different groups of people and industries. So these causes and effects are the similarities and differences between the 1830s and 1930s financial.
That is the 1830s versus 1930s financial crises. I hope this video helps and hope you all get a 5 on your AP test.